Today I'm joined with Ken Good. First, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, Ken, and tell us a little bit about your background and knowledge and experience in the criminal justice world, if you would.
Sure. Probably I would start by saying I am married. I have two daughters, probably my greatest choice of my life. Um, Grandson of a sharecropper who learned that hard work, you can make something of yourself. My parents were public school teachers. I had decided to go to law school, watching Perry Mason. And I went to law school and discovered I could write. I was on law review and I was on several national teams, and I was part of the team that was selected as best brief in the nation. I mean, corny stuff like that. I started practicing law over 30 years ago. I've argued cases at the Supreme Court of Texas, the Fifth Circuit, other courts of appeals across the state of Texas. I like appellate type issues. I kind of like to look at cases from a legalistic side of it. I started out practicing law, representing doctors in hospitals. I've been on court TV on a case, and so I've always worked very hard to get to the top of whatever I'm doing, even Christmas lights. I was doing Christmas lights for a while. It was highlighted in the New York Times and for silly things like Christmas lights. But I started representing the bail industry probably 25 years ago, and that has grown. And it was an issue that we needed expertise in. I went to a hearing in a federal case, and I disagreed completely with the way the case was going. I thought the judge did not understand the issues. And so I set out to become knowledgeable from my background as an appellate attorney on those types of issues. And so I guess that is what has got me here to this point. Excuse me. I've written a lot of articles on these issues. And, you know, the ultimate irony is that judge that set me into this, I think I was proven right. She's been reversed 5 or 6 or 7 times now
Wow.
on her determinations of these issues. And so I would say that I was proven that my concern was correct and that she was wrong on the issues.
Well, that's awesome. I guess you're definitely more qualified to be talking about this than me, so I'm glad you're here.
Well,
Um,
thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, as an attorney, we always learn that we can argue about the law and how the law applies to the facts, but we should always be able to agree on facts because facts are just that. They're facts. But this criminal justice reform, bail reform movement that we're in is one of these weird things. We just can't even agree on the facts. We can't agree on something as simple as is crime increasing? I mean, the people that are on the other side of this argument, they'll say, oh, crime's not increasing. It's just a perception that crime is increasing. And, I mean, you go, look at California, you look at New York, look at almost any urban city, look at San Francisco, and you go, I mean, the NAACP in Oakland is saying we've got a crime epidemic and we need a state of emergency. And they're like, oh, they're just all wrong. Crime is not increasing. I'm like, we can't even agree on simple facts on this debate. And that's what makes it very difficult.
what is the reason for this rise in crime? I mean, we talk a lot about the demonization of law enforcement. Do you think that's played a big role? And then I guess kind of the zero bail policies that you wanted to talk about.
Well, I think that the demonization of the police make it more difficult for the police to make arrests at times. But I think that is a contributing factor. But I do agree, or I do take the position that these bad bail reform policies that have been enacted in some of our urban areas are the leading cause of increasing crime. And the reason for that is, let's just compare numbers. The private bail industry has a failure to appear rate of less than 10%. That means, if you got 1,000 people scheduled to appear to court in a given week, less than 100 people are going to fail to appear. That's just the numbers. And if you try one of these other policies or these other simple release mechanisms, whether you call it zero bail, no bail, personal bond, they all have at least a 50% failure to appear rate. California's misdemeanor courts has an 80% failure to appear rate right now using that type of system. Harris County, which is using a similar system in Texas right now, has an 80% failure to appear rate. And so if you just compare the numbers, less than 100 versus 800, per week failure to appears, you can see what the impact of that is very, very quickly. It's going to be chaos because the courts are not equipped to handle that size or that number of failure to appears every week in our urban areas. And the problem with that is we still have the same number of cases filed on average added to the conveyor belt. And so we have this huge backlog unless they start just dismissing cases. So these bad bail reform policies, these zero bail policies, these personal bond policies are creating chaos, which causes de facto criminalization because you have to address the backlogs or your criminal justice system will collapse. And that's just what's happening. And, we've got elected officials who are now in a box because if they acknowledge that, then they're going to get an opponent who's going to double down on those types of policies. And so they don't know what to do. I think we've got elected officials who are just sitting there waiting for it to get so bad that their voters are pushing them to do what they already should be doing.
So I guess let's go kind of deeper into this whole bail issue. So I think a lot of my listeners probably don't even understand how bail works. So if you want to
Sure.
start with that.
Well, I come from the background of the private industry. The private industry bail system has been around for over 200 years. And at one point in time in our country, the way it worked was if you bonded somebody out of jail and they failed to show up for court, you took their place. And then it became a number of, a bail was a financial, it was like an insurance policy. So when you are bonded out of jail, you are buying an insurance policy for $1,000 or for $10,000, whatever the face amount of the bond is. And so you're paying a premium to a bond industry or a bail bond company to say, I guarantee that this defendant will show up for court. And so the bail industry has a great incentive to get you to come to court. And if you fail to appear, usually you have a personal relationship with the bonding company, so they'll tell you what's going to happen to get you back into the system. Or if you refuse, they have incentives to go and tell the police where you are and get you back into the system as quickly as possible. Because in our criminal justice system, justice delayed is justice denied. And so we need to get people back into the system as quickly as possible so we can get justice to, victims. And the reason for that is because if you don't go to court, then your case can't go forward under the Constitution. It has to be put on hold, except in very limited situations. And so if you don't show up, your case is put on hold until you come back. And these other release mechanisms, simple release, so whether it's zero bail or no bail or a personal bond, what they do is they issue a warrant, and that warrant goes down to the warrants department and joins all the other warrants waiting to be served, which in our urban areas is tens of thousands of warrants. And so that means you usually have to commit another crime to come back into the system unless you come back willingly. And so you get stopped on the side of the road, or you get arrested for burglary. They check your record and find that there's other warrants. And that's how you come back to your old criminal case. And so what the bail industry or what the bail system does, people keep saying, well, these people are not convicted. They shouldn't be held. And it's like, that doesn't have anything to do with bail. Bail is what promise, what assurance do you give to the court that you will return to answer the criminal charges? That's all it is. And what we have with these proponents for change is they're saying, well, you cannot hold somebody. I mean, they're pre-conviction, so they cannot be held. Well, if that's your position, it could be well-intentioned, but if that's your position that we cannot ever hold anybody, well, then the court's hands are tied. They can't hold career criminals, they can't hold organized crime members, and they can't hold gang members. And so that's kind of what we're seeing in some of our urban areas, because we have politicians who are taking the position that nobody can be held. And so crime is increasing because those criminal elements then see that as a green light to commit more crime. And they are making money hand over fist because of these maybe well-intentioned policies. I don't know if I agree that they're well-intentioned, but because of these policies that saying, well, we can't hold anybody. Well, then criminals see that and they commit a lot more crime until we change the policies.
So that makes sense to me that we would not let criminals out of jail, but
Mhm.
why can't we just, anyone that's accused of a crime, just hold them until the end of their trial?
Well, okay, so you have to go all the way back to the Magna Carta. And, the Magna Carta, okay, before the Magna Carta, which is the first document in England that put restrictions on the king's ability to do exactly what you're saying. So in England, before the Magna Carta, if the king was mad at you, he just accused you of a crime and then he held you and your case never was tried and you ultimately died in jail. And so the Magna Carta put restrictions on the courts, the king's ability to do that. And the concept of bail dates back from that. It just says, you cannot be held or you have an absolute right to be released unless certain things happen. Or you have you don't have a right to be released. I misspoke. You have a right to bail. And so if you're charged with a crime, under most states' constitutions, you have to have bail set. And so that's kind of the limitation on the government. They can set it. They may set it high because you have a criminal history. If you have a criminal history and they set a bond that's high, you're not in jail because you can't afford to pay it because you're poor. You're in jail because you have a criminal history, and that's the risk of you being released. And so the court, so under our system of government, like the Texas Constitution, which the majority of the constitutions of the states are similar, says unless you're charged with one of these really, really bad crimes like capital murder, you have a right to bail with sufficient sureties, which is the private industry. You don't have a right to zero bail. You don't have a right to personal bond. You don't have a right to no bond. You have a right to be released on a bond. You have a right to have a bond set by a court for a surety, a guarantee that you will show up for court. And that's where our system has grown. Our system has grown from the English system. And so it dates back to the Magna Carta. And so you don't have the right to just hold anybody until their trial, unless it's a crime authorized by the Texas Constitution or your state constitution.
So what is a personal bond? Can you explain that?
Sure. I call these release mechanisms that are used in different states that have different names. I just call simple release. Now, a personal bond is a bond without surety. So a $10,000 personal bond is just your promise that you're going to show up for court. It has a $10,000 number, but you're not paying anything to get out of jail. Under the Texas statute, they can charge you up 3%, but like in Harris County, the judges waive that, so you don't pay anything. So the number is just a fiction, or, well, really, it's the number you promise to pay if you fail to appear, but they don't ever collect those. So it's just a pinky promise that you'll show up for court. So a personal bond in Texas is a bond without surety.
So how do people even argue the fact that bail favors the rich? I guess I don't understand how.
Okay. So first of all, I would say the bail industry is an easy target. When you talk about criminal justice reform, the bail industry is an easy target. You always, I tell the bail industry people when I talk to them, bail bondsmen, I said, you work for 20, 30 years to get a good reputation, and it just takes one mistake or one, thing that makes you look bad to destroy your reputation. So they're an easy target. But I will also say that there was a town hall on News Nation, and there was a mayor on there, and she was a former judge, and she was saying, look, I don't agree with these attacks on the police, but I'm more than happy to try alternatives to the private industry bail system. But until you have an alternative that has the same low failure to appear rate and has the same level of accountability, you don't have an alternative. So I would say we all would like to find alternatives to the private industry bail. But if we're being honest and we're being honest about the facts, there's no other alternative that has the same level of the same low failure to appear rate and the same high level of accountability. And so if you're going to try any other mechanism, you are guaranteeing chaos, or because to be able to, resolve the same number of cases under any of those other release mechanisms, you'd have to have twice the number of courts. And they're not going to do that because they want to do something cheaper. And so that's the reason why you have a lot of this chaos being created. The alternatives are known not to perform as well, but the politics are forcing politicians to use those irrespective of the results. I mean, Illinois is the best example going on right now. It's being touted as the first state to get rid of the cash bail, but that's not even, the private industry. I mean, they've gotten rid of the private industry years before that. And that was why crime was increasing. Now they've gotten rid of cash bonds, which you just put up cash and to the courts. And that's going to even make it worse because that already has, their failure to appear rate was already high, and now it's going to be even worse. And, it has financial considerations for it because the courts were relying upon that money to pay for operations, and they're not replacing that. So the chaos in Illinois is going to get a lot worse.
So I guess, is there anything we can do differently? Is there any compromise on this issue, or do we just need to get back to the way we've always done things?
Well, that's a good question. I think if we could agree on the facts, we could then find a compromise on the policy solutions. But the problem is we can't agree on the facts. The facts are showing absolutely undisputable that these bad bail reform policies are complete failures. There's a study out of Yolo County, California, that shows that releasing someone on a zero bond, a simple release versus a private industry bond, the person released on simple release has a 200% greater chance of committing a violent crime in the next 18 months because of the lack of accountability. And so I was on a debate recently with probably, the someone from the law firm who's pushing all these policies. And they don't even agree that crime is increasing. So it's hard to find compromises when they keep arguing or they keep making arguments that have been reversed by the courts of appeals. I mean, there's 0 for 4 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. There's 0 for 5 or 6 cases at the U.S. courts of appeals across the country. And even when they lose an argument, they come back and say that's what the Constitution still requires, even though we have 2 courts of appeals from the United States Circuit Court of Appeals, the 5th and the 11th Circuit, reversing, saying they were wrong. And so I would say, the real hope, there is hope, but the hope is the Sanchez versus Alabama model, because in Sanchez versus Alabama, they were living under an injunction for 4 or 5 years that required them to do these simple release mechanisms and could not hold anyone accountable. They just had to, if they got them and they didn't show up, then they had to release them again and again and again and again. And the 11th Circuit reversed that preliminary injunction. And then they ultimately won the case, because what the courts are saying is you have a right to a hearing. You don't have a right to release. You have a right to say, hey, judge, I can't afford the bond you set it at. Please reconsider it. And if the judge has a hearing and reconsiders it and says, well, yeah, but you got this criminal history, so I'm going to leave it where it is. Well, then you're not in jail because you're poor. You're in jail because you have a criminal history. And the constitutional requirements were met. The Constitution sets a floor of the requirements. The states can do whatever they want above that floor. And, this law firm and our friends on the left are arguing that the Constitution sets out specific requirements that you can't hold anybody, and that keeps getting rejected by the court. So when that was reversed in Sanchez versus Alabama, they went back and reinstituted a system of accountability and got rid of this mindset that you couldn't do anything to people when they were arrested. And so it took about 6 months to change the mindset to start getting crime to come down again. But Sanchez versus Alabama is the model. It's absolutely the model, because it's the one result that shows that these counties that have implemented these bad bail reform policies can bring down crime by just following the example of that county.
So we know that these policies aren't working, that the liberals keep trying to push. Their crime's increasing all over the country, and that's a fact, as you pointed out. But what can somebody who's listening to this podcast as a call to action, what can we do to further see good policy go into effect around criminal justice and the criminal justice system?
Well, I think first you need to educate yourself. You know, our website, pbtx.com, has a blog where we highlight important stories in the bail industry and the criminal justice reform movement. We also have our own podcast called The Bail Post. You can find information on our PBTX website, or you can just go to thebailpost.com. And so you need to educate yourself about the different reform systems that are being talked about. So if people in your state are talking about, hey, we need to adopt the New Jersey plan, we have an episode about what the New Jersey plan is and why people want to do it. I mean, you haven't had anybody propose that since it was enacted because it's so expensive. But and so we talk about all the different issues going on in the criminal justice issue. Our next episode on the Bail Post talks about Illinois and what's going on there, and so people can just discover and become more enlightened. And then you can take that information to your local elected officials. You know, in California, they had a proposal to get rid of the private industry, and there was a whatever you call it, the proposition system, or however you get it on the ballot, and it was voted down. But now currently LA is going around that and implementing their own simple release mechanism, and, you know, saying, oh, it's a viable option. But, you know, it's interesting. Their own study that said it was a viable option, if you read it, it says crime will increase. So, and there's a whole history. I mean, I don't know if we've done an episode on it. We need to do one. The whole history of what's going on in California really dates back to overcrowded prisons and the inability or unwillingness of the electorate or the politicians to build more prisons. So this reform movement in California is really just because they've been ordered by the courts to release people. And so when you release criminals without having them be reformed, you know, you should expect crime to increase. And that's exactly what they've gotten. And now they're in a box. They can't do anything. They don't have the willingness to do it until the public requires it, because they just don't have the stomach to build more capacity to hold more people in jail.
Well, I definitely encourage more people to learn more about this and those resources you shared, the Bail Post podcast and pbtx.com, you said.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, those are great resources. I've looked at the podcast a little bit before, and definitely good information coming there. I guess, is there anything else you'd like to add about this before we kind of wrap things up here?
You know, one of the arguments that I think really resonates with people is they say, well, we have the largest jail population of the industrial world, and it's disproportionate among the races. And so that proves that we have this systemic racism going on that needs to be addressed through reforms. And I will just tell you that if you look at all the numbers and you look at everything, you'll find out that that's just political rhetoric. That is just jargon. That is poll tested language intended to cut off debate. We have the largest country in the world. We have the largest prison population, but where does every country in the world send their illegal drugs? They send them to the United States. So of course we're going to have a larger population. And, you know, we did a podcast recently looking at Minnesota, saying that there is not systemic racism. And it was a report, and it's very illuminating because it says there's a disproportionate amount of crime being committed in our inner cities, but the inner cities have a disproportionate amount of minority populations. And so we have a disproportionate amount of crime being committed by certain minorities. And so we're going to, until we address that, and if we just continue to enact these policies without addressing why we have an inequity in the amount of crime being increased, we're actually making the problems worse, because then they're going back into those minority communities and committing even more crime. So we have to look at these policies and say, okay, they sound good. And, you know, the acidic language that's being spoken by the left makes it sound like we have no other choice. But I'm just telling you, the policies that they're pushing with this toxic language that's intended to cut off debate is actually hurting the very people that they say they're wanting to protect. That's the people that are getting hurt the worst, because crime increases in that community higher and more quickly than it does at the public. And so until we have a recognition of that simple. I mean, it's a fact. It's just a fact that nobody wants to agree to. And, I was even told, don't do a podcast on that. That's kind of, you're getting close to the line. You could be declared racist if you don't look. The facts are the facts. And, that's where we are. We can't agree on the facts. There's facts that we're told we can't even talk about. And if we don't talk about those facts, then we're going to make it worse for the very minority groups that we say that we are there because we feel their pain. No, we don't. We have another agenda. And so we've got to find out what that is, and we've got to address it. But the bad bail reform policies and the bad criminal justice policies that they're proposing are not the solution.
Well, you can't debate facts, that's for sure. Once again, I just want to thank you, Ken, for coming on the podcast today, sharing your expertise with my listeners, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me.